The Dakota Territory in the 1870s was a land of cruel beauty, a place that promised everything, and could take it all away in a heartbeat. For a lone woman homesteading on the edge of civilization, survival was a daily battle, fought not with bullets, but with sheer grit. This is the story of Rebecca McGregor, a widow who thought her greatest enemies were drought and loneliness. She was wrong. In an act of pure instinct, she would save 2 lives from being swallowed by the earth itself. But in the Old West, no good deed goes unpunished, and 3 days after her act of mercy, she would look to the horizon and see her kindness returned, in the form of a war party numbering in the hundreds, riding directly for her home. This is the true story of how one woman's courage was put to the ultimate test. The silence of the Dakota prairie was a living thing. It had a weight, a texture, and for Rebecca McGregor, it was a constant companion. It had been 2 years since the fever took her husband Thomas, leaving her with nothing but a half-finished cabin, a stubborn plot of land near Cottonwood Creek, and a silence so profound it often felt louder than the screech of the northern winds. Her life was a rhythm of survival each day, a litany of chores that left her muscles aching and her mind blessedly numb. She rose before the sun painted the eastern sky in shades of rose and lavender, her hands already rough from the lye soap and the splintered wood of the fence posts she was constantly mending. She was a woman carved from the landscape itself, tall, sturdy, with eyes the color of a stormy sky, and a face that had forgotten the easy art of smiling. Her homestead was an island in a sea of grass. 15 miles to the east lay the dusty fledgling town of Redemption Creek, a place she visited only when supplies of salt flour or ammunition ran perilously low. The town was a microcosm of the frontier, a handful of decent folk drowned out by a cacophony of suspicious whispers, hardened prospectors, and land-hungry ranchers. The undisputed king of that small kingdom was a man named Silas Croft. He was a rancher with an insatiable appetite for land, and his vast herds of cattle were slowly strangling the smaller homesteads. Croft had made no secret of his desire for Rebecca's plot, with its invaluable access to the year-round flow of Cottonwood Creek. He'd made her offers first polite, then condescending, and finally veiled with a threat that lingered in the air long after he'd ridden away. "This is no place for a woman alone," Mrs. McGregor, he'd said on his last visit, his cold eyes sweeping over her property with an owner's gaze. Savages, wolves, the winter. Any one of them could swallow you whole. Rebecca had simply gripped the handle of her axe a little tighter and replied, "I've faced worse than wolves, Mr. Croft. But the threat that truly permeated the air wasn't from ranchers or the elements. It was the unspoken tension with the Sioux. The Battle of the Little Bighorn was a fresh, bleeding wound in the nation's psyche, and in this part of the territory, the fear was palpable. Settlers saw warriors in every shadow, and the Lakota Sioux pushed from their lands, and watching the buffalo disappear, saw the homesteads as a scar upon their ancestral hunting grounds. An uneasy, fragile peace held, but it was a peace as thin as ice in springtime. Rebecca, however, held a different view, one she learned from her late husband. Thomas had been a surveyor, a man who believed in lines on a map, but also in the unwritten laws of respect. "They were here first, Rebecca," he used to say, gesturing to the endless horizon. "We're the guests. We'd do well to remember that." His words were a quiet counter-melody to the panicked rhetoric she heard in town. On this particular Tuesday in late August, the air was thick and heavy, promising a thunderstorm that refused to break. The heat shimmered above the prairie, distorting the horizon. Rebecca was leading her mule Beatrice back from the creek, the animal laden with 2 full barrels of water. Her rifle, a Winchester .73 that had been Thomas's pride and joy, was strapped to the mule's side. It was a permanent fixture, as essential as a water canteen or a knife. As she crested the small rise that overlooked the lower flats near the creek, she paused. The silence was different. It wasn't the peaceful, humming silence of a hot afternoon. This was a dead silence, the kind that comes when every bird has stopped singing and every cricket has ceased its chirping. A primal instinct, honed by 2 years of solitude, prickled the back of her neck. Her eyes scanned the landscape. The creek bed, the scattered cottonwoods, the distant bluffs. Nothing seemed out of place. She chided herself for being jumpy. The heat could play tricks on a person's mind. She clucked her tongue, urging Beatrice forward. They had just begun their descent when a sound cut through the stillness. It was faint, almost lost in the vastness, but it was unmistakable, a high, thin cry. It wasn't an animal. It was the sound of a child. Rebecca froze her hand, resting on the warm stock of the Winchester. Her heart hammered against her ribs. In this land, a child's cry was rarely a sign of anything good. It could be a trap, a lure set by bandits or desperate men. The stories she'd heard in Redemption Creek flooded her mind, tales of decoys and brutal ambushes. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back to get to the safety of her cabin and bar the door. But then the cry came again, sharper this time, laced with a desperate terror that transcended language and politics. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated fear. It was the sound of a child who believed he was about to die. Thomas's voice echoed in her memory, calm and steady. "You do what's right, Rebecca. Not what's easy." Taking a deep breath that did little to calm her racing pulse, Rebecca unstrapped the rifle. She tethered Beatrice to a scraggly bush, her movements precise and automatic. Holding the Winchester at a low ready, she moved forward, stepping carefully down the slope towards the source of the cry, her eyes scanning every shadow, every rock for a threat that she was sure was waiting. The oppressive silence had been broken, and Rebecca had a chilling feeling that her life, like the weather, was about to violently and irrevocably break with it. The source of the cries was a marshy, deceptive patch of land, 50 yards from the main channel of Cottonwood Creek. From a distance, it looked like any other part of the riverbank, a flat expanse of damp earth and sparse, hardy grass. But recent rains, followed by the baking heat, had created a hidden menace Rebecca knew well. Quicksand. The settlers called it prairie gumbo, a treacherous mix of fine sand, clay, and water that could create a vacuum, pulling down anything with weight. As she drew closer, the scene came into sharp, horrifying focus. 2 Sioux boys were trapped. One, who looked to be no older than 12 or 13, was sunk to his chest, his arms flailing uselessly against the thick grey mud that held him fast. His face was a mask of grim determination, his dark eyes wide with a fear he was trying desperately to contain for the sake of the other. The second boy, much younger, perhaps 7 or 8, was in even greater peril. He was closer to the center of the pit, submerged to his shoulders, his head barely above the surface. It was his terrified, piercing cries that had reached Rebecca. A few yards away, a pony, a beautiful pinto, lay on its side, its legs kicking weakly. It had clearly wandered into the mire first, and in their attempt to save it, the boys had become ensnared themselves. The pony was already lost, its breathing shallow and ragged. For a long moment, Rebecca remained at the edge of the solid ground, the Winchester held tight in her hands. The boys saw her. The older one stopped, struggling, his body going rigid. His eyes full of fear a moment ago, now hardened with defiant mistrust. He barked a sharp command at the younger boy, who fell silent, his cries catching in his throat, replaced by hiccuping sobs. They stared at her, two wild, terrified creatures who saw not a potential savior, but a white woman with a rifle, an enemy. Rebecca's mind raced. The panicked voices from Redemption Creek screamed in her head, "They're Sioux! Leave them! It's not your fight! It's a trap!" But her eyes were locked on the younger boy's face, streaked with mud and tears, his small body trembling uncontrollably. She saw not a savage, not an enemy, but a child. A terrified child watching his own grave slowly swallow him. "All right, boys, hold still," she said, her voice coming out steadier than she felt. "Don't struggle." They couldn't understand her words, but the command to stay still was universal. The older boy seemed to grasp the futility of fighting the mud and stopped moving his gaze, never leaving her. Rebecca laid the rifle down carefully on a patch of dry grass, a deliberate gesture to show she meant no harm. The older boy's eyes flickered to the discarded weapon, a spark of confusion in their depths. She knew she couldn't get close. The ground around them was a death trap. She needed leverage. Her eyes scanned the area and landed on a dead, sun-bleached cottonwood log lying 20 feet away. It was long and thick, heavy but manageable. Adrenaline surged through her. She ran to the log, her boots sinking slightly in the soft earth at its edges. Heaving with a strength born of years of farm labor, she began to roll it, digging her heels in her muscles, straining. It moved agonizingly slowly, but it moved. She grunted with the effort, her focus narrowed to this single Herculean task. She managed to roll the log to the edge of the quicksand pit, positioning it so it lay perpendicular to the boys. It was a bridge, a lifeline. Without hesitating, she lay flat on her stomach on the log, the rough bark digging into her skin, and began to inch her way out over the mire. The stench of stagnant water and decaying earth rose up to meet her. Below, the mud bubbled softly. She focused on the younger boy first. He was weaker and deeper. "I'm coming," she said softly, more to herself than to him. "Just hold on." As she got closer, the boy began to cry again, a low, terrified whimper. The older boy shouted something, his voice sharp with alarm. He clearly thought she was coming to harm them. Rebecca ignored him. She shimmied forward until she was almost within arm's reach of the little one. But it wasn't enough. She couldn't get a good grip. She needed a rope. Cursing her lack of foresight, she began the slow, frustrating process of backing up off the log. Back on solid ground, she sprinted to her mule Beatrice, who watched the proceedings with nervous, twitching ears. Rebecca untied the thick lariat from her saddle, her fingers working quickly at the knots. Rope in hand, she returned to the log, her heart pounding with a desperate urgency. The younger boy's head seemed lower now, the mud creeping up his neck. Once again, she crawled out onto the log. "Here," she called, her voice sharp. She expertly looped the rope, creating a wide lasso. "Put this over your head, under your arms." She demonstrated on herself, miming the motion. The older boy watched his face, a mixture of suspicion and dawning hope. He translated her gestures into a series of urgent commands to his brother. The little boy, his eyes wide with terror, fumbled to obey his small, muddy hands, struggling to get the rope over his head. Finally, with a desperate wriggle, he managed to work the loop under his armpits. "Hold tight!" Rebecca yelled. She scrambled back to the edge of the log, planting her feet firmly on the ground. She wrapped the rope around her waist, leaned back, and began to pull. It was like trying to pull a boulder from the earth. The suction was immense. For a terrifying moment, nothing happened. Rebecca's boots slipped, and she fell to one knee, the rope biting cruelly into her hands and waist. She gritted her teeth, ignoring the pain, and pulled again, this time with a raw cry of exertion. Slowly, agonizingly, the boy began to move. The mud released its grip with a sickening slurping sound. Inch by inch, she dragged him through the muck towards the log. He was crying openly now, a mixture of pain and relief. Once he was close enough, he was able to grab onto the log, his small hands clinging with surprising strength. Rebecca didn't rest. "Now you," she grunted, turning her attention to the older boy. She recoiled the wet, muddy rope and tossed it to him. He caught it deftly. He was stronger, and with the knowledge that it worked, he helped by pushing with his arms as she pulled. He came free more easily, his lean, muscular body fighting the suction. Within minutes, both boys were lying on the solid ground beside her, covered in grey, stinking mud, shivering and exhausted. They lay gasping for air, their ordeal over. The pinto, forgotten in the chaos, had finally succumbed. Its struggle ceased. Rebecca stood over them, her own body trembling with adrenaline and exhaustion. Her hands were raw and bleeding, her clothes caked in mud. The three of them were a tableau of shared survival, a white woman and two Sioux children, bound by a moment of life and death. The older boy pushed himself up to a sitting position. He looked at Rebecca, then at his brother, then at the dead pony. His face was unreadable. He then looked directly into Rebecca's eyes, and for the first time, the hostility was gone, replaced by something deep and complex. Gratitude, confusion, shame, perhaps. He gave a short, sharp nod, a gesture of acknowledgement that needed no translation. Then, helping his younger, still shaking brother to his feet, he turned, and without a backward glance, the two of them disappeared into the tall prairie grass, leaving Rebecca alone with the dead pony, the oppressive silence, and the profound certainty that something had just shifted in her world, as surely and as irrevocably as the turning of the earth. The sun began its slow descent, bleeding orange and purple across the vast sky by the time Rebecca got back to her cabin. The ordeal had left her drained, every muscle screaming in protest. After pulling the boys from the mud, she had spent another hour in a grim, exhausting task, using Beatrice and her remaining rope to drag the dead pinto from the quicksand. She couldn't bear the thought of leaving it to be picked apart by coyotes where it lay. She dragged it to higher ground and covered it with a cairn of rocks, a small, silent monument to the afternoon's chaos. It was a gesture of respect she couldn't quite explain even to herself. Inside her cabin, the familiar scent of wood smoke and dried herbs did little to calm her frayed nerves. She washed the mud from her skin in a basin of cold water, wincing as the soap stung the raw rope burns on her hands. As she worked, her mind replayed the events with a startling clarity, the terror in the younger boy's eyes, the defiant pride in the older ones, the final silent nod before they vanished. She hadn't told them her name. They hadn't told her theirs. There was no common language between them, only the universal dialect of desperation and relief. Now, in the aftermath, a cold unease began to creep in, chilling her more than the evening air. She had interfered. In the rigid, unwritten code of the frontier, she had crossed a line. The people of Redemption Creek would not see her actions as a simple act of human decency. They would see it as consorting with the enemy. The next 2 days passed in a haze of anxious waiting. Every gust of wind sounded like hoofbeats. Every shadow on the horizon looked like an approaching rider. She did her chores with the Winchester, slung over her shoulder, her head constantly on a swivel. She slept poorly, her dreams filled with images of sucking mud and accusing eyes. She was a woman on an island, and she could feel the tide of trouble rising around her. News like wildfire travels fast on an empty prairie. It was on the 3rd day that her fears were given a name and a face. She was splitting firewood when she saw the dust cloud in the east, the telltale sign of riders coming from the direction of Redemption Creek. Her hand went instinctively to the axe handle, her knuckles white. There were 2 of them, Sheriff Brody and to her profound dismay, Silas Croft. Sheriff Brodie was a man worn down by his job. He was paunchy and grey, with a perpetually weary expression, a man who preferred to de-escalate rather than confront. He was in his own way a fair man, but he was also a politician who knew his salary was paid by powerful men like the one who rode beside him. Silas Croft, by contrast, sat tall and straight in his expensive leather saddle, his face set in a mask of smug authority. He was the one who did the talking. Mrs. McGregor Croft began not bothering with pleasantries as he dismounted. His eyes raked over her from her worn leather boots to the stray strands of hair that had escaped her bun. "We heard a rather disturbing story in town. I imagine you did, Mr. Croft?" Rebecca said, her voice flat. She refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her fear. Sheriff Brodie shifted uncomfortably. "Rebecca folks are saying you helped a couple of Sioux boys, that you pulled them from the gumbo down by the creek. Is that a crime, now, Sheriff, helping children?" Croft let out a short, derisive laugh. "Children? Those were hostiles. Every one of them is a viper in the grass, just waiting to strike. You should have left them for the buzzards. It would have saved us trouble down the line." The callousness of his words struck Rebecca like a physical blow. "They were boys," she repeated, her voice low and dangerous. "And they were dying. And in saving them, you may have just condemned us all," Croft retorted, stepping closer. He lowered his voice, a conspiratorial, menacing tone. "Their war party will see it as a sign of weakness. They'll think this land is soft, protected by women who'll aid their spawn. They'll come back, not with thanks, but with torches and knives. And when they do, the first cabin they visit will be this one. You've put a target on your own back, and on the whole valley." Sheriff Brodie finally spoke up, his voice placating. "Now, Silas, we don't know that for sure. Rebecca, all we're saying is it was reckless. People are scared. With the anniversary of the Custer massacre just past, tensions are high. So I should have let them die to make people in town feel safer." Rebecca shot back, her gaze fixed on Croft. "You should have thought about your own kind," Croft sneered. "But your late husband always did have a soft spot for them, didn't he? Filled your head with foolish ideas. Looks like he left more than just this worthless plot behind." The mention of Thomas was a deliberate cruelty, a knife twisted in an old wound. Rebecca's grip on the axe handle tightened so much she thought the wood might crack. For a breathless moment, the urge to swing it to wipe the smug look off Silas Croft's face was almost overwhelming. Sheriff Brodie saw the look in her eyes and quickly stepped between them. "That's enough, Silas. We've said our piece. Rebecca, we're just warning you. Lock your doors. Be careful. The town council has voted to post extra lookouts. If you see anything, you fire 2 shots in the air and we'll ride out." It wasn't an offer of help. It was a warning. They weren't coming to protect her. They were coming to fight what she had supposedly invited. As they mounted their horses, Croft leaned down from his saddle, his face inches from hers. "I made you a fair offer for this land, Mrs. McGregor. It's still on the table for now. When they come and you're screaming for help, you'll wish you'd taken it." He spurred his horse, and the 2 men rode off, leaving Rebecca in a cloud of dust and impotent rage. The seeds of fear they had planted took root immediately. Croft hadn't just been guessing, he had been prophesying, and he would do everything in his power to make his prophecy come true. He would twist her act of compassion into an act of treason. She was no longer just the widow McGregor on her isolated homestead. She was the Indian lover, the woman who had betrayed her own people. As the sun cast long shadows across the prairie, Rebecca checked the loads in her Winchester. She barred the heavy oak door and shuttered the windows. She was alone completely and utterly alone, trapped between the silent judgment of the prairie and the loud, violent fear of the town. She didn't know which one was more dangerous. All she knew was that Croft was right about one thing. Someone was coming. The only question was who and why. The third day dawned heavy and grey, the sky a bruised, featureless expanse. A suffocating humidity pressed down on the prairie, a physical manifestation of the dread that had settled deep in Rebecca's bones. The world seemed to be holding its breath. Inside her cabin, Rebecca moved with a restless energy unable to settle. Every routine task was a distraction, a way to keep her mind from dwelling on the image of riders cresting the hill. She churned butter with a furious, rhythmic motion, the thumping of the dasher a counterpoint to the frantic beating of her own heart. She sharpened her axe on the grinding wheel, the shriek of steel on stone setting her teeth on edge. She was preparing for a siege, though she didn't know if the enemy was real or a phantom conjured by Silas Croft's malice. Croft, true to his nature, had not been idle. Word had already filtered back to her through the only person from Redemption Creek who still dared to speak to her old Jebediah Stone, a grizzled prospector, who occasionally traded with her for fresh eggs and mending. He had ridden out at dawn, his face grim. "You need to watch your back, Rebecca," he'd said, refusing to even dismount, as if being seen near her cabin was a contagion. "Croft's been talking. He's telling everyone you're in league with the Sioux. Says you're a scout for them, that you gave those boys information in exchange for your own safety." "That's insane," Rebecca breathed, stunned by the venom of the lie. "Insane don't matter when folks are scared," Jebediah countered, spitting a stream of tobacco juice. "He's got 'em riled up good, talking about forming a militia to protect the valley. His words, not mine. All he needs is an excuse, a single feather out of place, and he'll lead them on a tear. He wants your land, Rebecca. He's using this to get it one way or another." After Jebediah left, the isolation felt more complete than ever. She was an outcast. Her act of saving 2 children had been twisted into a narrative of betrayal. She thought of Thomas, of his belief in doing what was right. Had he been naive? Had his quiet integrity been a luxury they could no longer afford in this harsh, unforgiving land? Doubt, a venomous serpent, began to coil in her heart. Had she done the right thing? The faces of the boys, so clear in her memory, gave her the answer. Yes, it was right. But being right, she was quickly learning, could be a very dangerous thing. Late in the afternoon, as she was reinforcing the latch on her small barn, she saw him, a lone rider sitting on his horse on the ridge to the west, the direction the boys had gone. He was too far away to make out any details, just a stark silhouette against the oppressive grey sky. He wasn't a settler. The way he sat his horse, the lines of his figure, he was a Sioux warrior, a scout. Rebecca's blood ran cold. He just sat there, motionless, watching. Was he a herald? A harbinger of what was to come? Was he counting her livestock, studying the layout of her cabin, planning an attack? Croft's words echoed in her ears. They'll come back. Not with thanks, but with torches and knives. She backed away slowly, her heart hammering, and slipped into the relative darkness of the barn. Peeking through a crack in the wooden slats, she watched him. For what felt like an eternity, he remained as still as a statue. He was a patient, terrifying omen. Then, as silently as he appeared, he turned his horse and vanished over the ridge. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. This was it. The scout had seen what he needed to see. He was going back to report. They would come at night. As dusk began to settle, she did a final check of her small fortress. The windows were shuttered tight, the door barred. She had 2 buckets of water ready in case of fire. The Winchester was loaded, and a box of extra cartridges sat on the small table next to it. Thomas's old Colt revolver, heavy and cold, was tucked into the waistband of her skirt. She didn't light a lamp, not wanting to make her cabin a beacon in the encroaching darkness. She sat in a chair by the main window, a narrow slit in the shutter, giving her a sliver of a view of the darkening prairie. The silence was back, but it was no longer a companion. It was a predator filled with 1,000 imagined sounds, the snap of a twig, the whinny of a horse, the whisper of a moccasin on dry earth. Hours passed. The moonless night was absolute, a blanket of impenetrable black. Her eyes ached from straining to see into the darkness. Her muscles were knotted with tension. Every nerve was stretched taut, vibrating with a fear so intense it was almost a physical pain. She thought about the life she had tried to build here, the hopes she and Thomas had poured into this unforgiving soil. Was it all going to end in fire and blood because she had refused to let 2 children die? Her anger began to burn through the fear. Anger at Silas Croft for his greed and his lies. Anger at the townspeople for their blind prejudice. Anger at the injustice of a world where an act of mercy could be twisted into a death sentence. If they were coming, she would not die, cowering in a corner. She was Rebecca McGregor. She had buried a husband, survived 2 Dakota winters alone, and stared down Silas Croft. She would face whatever came out of the darkness on her own 2 feet. She rose from the chair and walked to the hearth, her hand resting on the cold stones. Above it, on the mantelpiece, was a small, faded photograph of her and Thomas, taken on their wedding day. They were so young, their faces filled with a hope she could barely remember feeling. "I did what was right, Thomas," she whispered into the darkness of the cabin. "I hope it was enough." Suddenly a new sound reached her. It was low and deep, a rhythmic vibration that she felt more than heard, coming through the very floorboards of the cabin. It was the sound of the earth itself trembling. It was a sound she had never heard before, but she knew with a certainty that stole the air from her lungs what it was. It was the sound of hundreds of horses. They were coming. The deep, resonant thrumming grew steadily, a terrifying crescendo that seemed to emanate from the heart of the world. It was a sound that bypassed the ears and went straight to the bone. Rebecca stood frozen in the center of her cabin, the floor vibrating beneath her feet. The whispers of the storm had become a roar. This was not a small raiding party. This was not a handful of vengeful warriors. This was a force of nature. She moved to the shuttered window, her hands shaking as she peered through the narrow slit. At first, the pre-dawn gloom revealed nothing but the familiar undulating lines of her land. Then she saw it. On the long ridge to the west, where the lone scout had been, the horizon began to change. It was as if the dark line of the earth was detaching itself from the sky, rising up, taking on new forms. Silhouettes appeared one by one, then in dozens, then in scores. Warriors on horseback, their forms stark and menacing against the bruised twilight sky. They were a living forest of lances, bows, and the occasional glint of rifle barrels. They just kept coming, pouring over the ridge, in a seemingly endless river of men and horses, until the entire horizon was a jagged line of silent, waiting figures. Rebecca's breath hitched in her throat. She tried to count, but it was impossible. There were at least 200, maybe more. An entire tribe. A war party of a size that hadn't been seen in this valley since the bloodiest days of the Indian Wars. They weren't charging. They were waiting a gesture that was somehow more terrifying than an all-out assault. It was a display of power, a statement of overwhelming force. They owned this land, this horizon, and they were showing her that her small cabin, her fences, her very life existed only at their pleasure. Her mind, numbed with terror, raced through her options. There were none. Fighting was suicide. Fleeing was impossible. The 2 shots in the air, the signal for the town, was a laughable notion. By the time Sheriff Brody and Croft's militia could arrive, there would be nothing left but smoking embers. Croft had gotten his wish. He had his excuse, but she would be the price paid for it. The silence stretched taut and agonizing. The entire prairie seemed to be listening. Then a single rider detached himself from the main group and began to ride slowly down the slope towards her cabin. He was followed by 2 others. As they drew closer, Rebecca could begin to make out details. The lead rider was a man of commanding presence, his face stern, and weathered his hair streaked with grey. He wore a magnificent eagle-feather war bonnet that trailed down his back. This was a chief, a man of great authority. Behind him, on a single horse, rode the 2 boys. Her heart leapt into her throat. They were clean now, their hair braided, wearing simple buckskin leggings. The older boy sat tall, his face impassive, but the younger one kept glancing nervously towards her cabin, his small hands clutching the mane of the horse. Why had they brought the boys to identify her, to point out the woman who had interfered, so that retribution could be exacted? The cold knot of fear in her stomach tightened. The 3 riders stopped about 100 yards from her door, a respectful yet intimidating distance. The chief sat on his horse, his dark eyes fixed on her cabin, as if he could see her through the thick wooden walls. He was waiting. What did he want for her to come out? To face her judgment in the open, every instinct screamed at her to stay inside, to use the cabin's meager defenses. But another thought, a quieter, more insistent one, pushed its way through the terror. Hiding was the act of a coward or of the guilty. She had done nothing wrong. She had acted with honor. If this was to be her end, she would meet it with the same honor. She would not let them or the ghost of Silas Croft say that she died hiding under a bed. Taking a shuddering breath, she unbarred the door. The heavy oak groaned in protest as she pulled it open. The grey morning light flooded the cabin, momentarily blinding her. She stepped outside onto her porch, blinking to adjust her eyes. She left the Winchester just inside the door within easy reach, but she came out with her hands empty and held slightly out from her sides a universal sign of peace. The world was eerily quiet, the only sound the soft snorting of the horses and the whisper of the wind through the grass. The vast assembly of warriors on the ridge watched in absolute silence, their collective gaze a physical weight. The chief's eyes met hers. They were dark and penetrating, holding a wisdom and a weariness that seemed as ancient as the land itself. There was no discernible malice in them, but no warmth either. They were simply watching, waiting, judging. Rebecca stood tall, her fear a cold, hard stone in her belly, but she refused to let it show. She lifted her chin a fraction. She had rescued 2 of their children. She did not know if she was about to be punished or thanked, if this was an execution or a negotiation. She only knew that this was the moment of reckoning. The silence had finally broken. The storm had arrived, and she was standing in the very eye of it. The chief raised his right hand palm open, a gesture of parley. He spoke his voice, deep and resonant, the Lakota words flowing like a river, ancient and powerful. Rebecca, of course, understood none of them, but the tone was not aggressive. It was measured, formal, and solemn. He paused, his gaze unwavering. When it was clear she didn't understand, he gestured towards the 2 boys. The older boy nudged his horse forward a few steps. He looked at Rebecca, and for the first time she saw a flicker of emotion on his stoic face, something akin to respect. He spoke a single word in halting, heavily accented English, a word likely learned from traders or the reservation. "Father," he said, nodding towards the chief. The pieces clicked into place. This wasn't a random war chief. This was their father. He had not come with a tribe. He had come with his family, his clan, his people, to face the woman who had touched the lives of his sons. The chief, whose name Rebecca would later learn, was Black Eagle, spoke again this time, using a combination of his own language and a series of slow, deliberate hand gestures. He pointed to the boys, then to the ground near the creek, and mimicked a sinking, struggling motion. His hands conveyed the panic, the desperation, the sucking mud. Then he pointed directly at Rebecca. He flattened one hand palm up and placed his other hand on top of it, a gesture of lifting of support. He raised his hands together, a clear depiction of her pulling his sons from the earth. Finally, he touched his own chest over his heart and bowed his head slightly. There was no mistaking the meaning. This was not a declaration of war. It was an expression of profound gratitude, a wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled Rebecca's knees washed over her. The terror that had held her in its icy grip for 3 days began to recede, replaced by a sense of stunned disbelief. But the moment was shattered by the thunder of hoofbeats from the east. From the direction of Redemption Creek, a group of riders appeared, galloping hard. At their lead was Silas Croft, a rifle held high, his face a mask of righteous fury. Behind him rode Sheriff Brody and about 20 other men from the town ranch. Hands prospectors and shopkeepers all armed their faces, a mixture of fear and grim determination. They were Croft's militia. They skidded to a halt 50 yards away, creating a tense triangle between Rebecca's cabin, Black Eagle's party, and themselves. "See," Croft roared, his voice ringing across the prairie, directed at his men, but meant for all to hear. "Just as I told you, a whole hornet's nest ready to sting. They've surrounded her. We got here just in time." Sheriff Brody looked from the massive silent assembly on the ridge to the lone woman standing on her porch and the 3 riders before her. His face was pale. This was not the small raiding party he had been led to expect. This was an army. "Hold your fire," Brody yelled, his voice strained. "Nobody shoot! Don't be a fool, Brody!" Croft spat, chambering around in his rifle with a loud metallic click that echoed in the charged silence. "This is our chance. We can break them right here. For Custer. For all the good folk they've butchered." He was trying to incite a massacre, using Rebecca as the justification. She saw his plan with horrifying clarity to provoke a fight, and in the ensuing chaos, the Sioux would be blamed for her death, and he would eventually claim her land. "You're wrong," Rebecca shouted, her voice carrying with surprising strength. "They came in peace." "Peace," Croft laughed, a wild, unhinged sound. "Look at them, they're armed for war. She's a traitor, boys. She's made a deal with them to save her own skin." Black Eagle watched the newcomers, his face impassive, but his eyes hard as flint. The warriors on the ridge had not moved, but Rebecca could feel the shift in their posture. 100 arrows were ready to be knocked to bowstrings. 100 rifles were ready to be shouldered. A single shot would unleash a tidal wave of violence that would wash over them all. Black Eagle turned his attention back to Rebecca. He spoke a sharp command. The younger of his sons, the one she had pulled from the deepest part of the mire, slid off the horse. He walked forward on hesitant legs, clutching something in his hands, a long, beautifully beaded sheath containing a hunting knife. He stopped before her porch, his eyes downcast, and held it up to her as an offering. It was a gesture of immense significance, a personal gift from a child. As Rebecca reached down to accept it, Croft saw his chance. "It's a signal," he screamed. "Fire, fire now!" He raised his rifle, taking aim not at the warriors, but directly at Rebecca. If he could kill her, he could claim she was caught in the crossfire, the first victim of a savage attack she had brought upon them. But Sheriff Brody, who had been watching the scene, unfold the chief's gestures. The boy's gift, Rebecca's calm demeanor, finally understood. He saw Croft's raw, naked greed for what it was. In that split second, the weary, beleaguered lawman made a choice. "Croft, no." Brody yelled and spurred his horse forward, slamming it into the side of Croft's mount. Croft's rifle discharged the shot, going wide, cracking harmlessly through the morning air. The sound was like a thunderclap in the tense silence. On the ridge boughs were raised. The air vibrated with deadly intent. Black Eagle let out a tremendous cry, a command that echoed across the valley. Instantly, every warrior froze. He had stopped the attack, holding back the tide of war with the sheer force of his will. Croft, thrown off balance, struggled to control his horse. His face contorted with rage. "You damned fool, Brody! You've doomed us all! The only fool here is you, Silas." Brody said, his voice low and steady, as he drew his own revolver and pointed it squarely at Croft's chest. "You came here for a fight, not a rescue. I'm tired of men like you starting fires and calling it self-defense. Drop the rifle now." The men in the militia who had been ready to follow Croft into battle now looked confused. Their rifles half raised their eyes, darting between their enraged leader and the determined sheriff. They saw the truth now. This wasn't a battle for survival. It was a land dispute about to explode into a massacre. One by one, they lowered their weapons. Silas Croft, surrounded by the silent judgment of the Sioux, the newfound steel of the sheriff, and the wavering loyalty of his own men, was trapped. His face turned a mottled red, and with a curse that was swallowed by the vast prairie, he let his rifle fall to the dust. The immediate crisis was over. The single gunshot still hung in the air, a testament to how close they had all come to the abyss. In its wake, a new fragile silence descended. With the threat from Croft neutralized, Black Eagle turned his attention back to the matter at hand. He gave another quiet order. From the massive assembly on the ridge, a group of men began to move down the slope. They were not warriors, but herders, and they were driving a small band of horses before them. There were 5 of them, strong, sturdy paints, and Appaloosas, the kind of quality horse flesh that was a form of currency on the plains. They were not war ponies. They were mares, a sign of wealth and future prosperity. The men herded them into Rebecca's small makeshift corral and then retreated, melting back into the larger group. Black Eagle dismounted, a sign of great respect. He walked towards Rebecca's porch, stopping at the bottom step. He gestured to the horses in the corral, then to Rebecca. He then pointed to his 2 sons and once again placed his hand over his heart. The message was clear beyond all need for words. "You saved 2 of my sons. I give you 5 horses. A life is beyond value, but this is our way. We honor your courage. We repay our debt." Rebecca stood on her porch, the boy's knife clutched in her hand, and looked at the gift. 5 horses represented a small fortune. They were life transportation and security. It was a gift of such magnitude that it left her speechless. She looked at the chief, this powerful man who had held back a war with a single word, and saw not a fearsome enemy, but a father, his face etched with a gratitude that mirrored her own relief. She walked down the steps, stopping a few feet from him. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet but clear. She met his gaze and nodded a gesture of respect between 2 people who, despite the vast cultural chasm between them, understood the fundamental truths of courage and debt. Black Eagle held her gaze for a long moment, then gave a single sharp nod in return. He turned, mounted his horse with a fluid grace that defied his age, and rejoined his sons. Without another word, he raised his hand, and the entire tribe, as one, turned their horses and began to ride back over the ridge. Their departure was as silent and awe-inspiring as their arrival. In minutes, the horizon was empty once more. It was as if they had been a dream, a vision conjured by the prairie itself, leaving behind only 5 horses in a corral and a new profound silence. The tension broke. The men from Redemption Creek began to murmur amongst themselves, their gazes shifting from the empty horizon to Silas Croft, who sat on his horse under the sheriff's gun, his face a thunderous mask of humiliation. They looked at Rebecca, standing alone in her yard, and for the first time they saw not a traitor, but a woman of incredible fortitude who had faced down an entire tribe and earned their respect. "Take him to town, boys," Sheriff Brody said, his voice weary but firm. "Lock him up. We'll charge him with attempted murder and anything else that'll stick." As 2 men disarmed a sputtering Croft and led him away, Sheriff Brody rode up to Rebecca's porch. He tipped his hat, an uncharacteristic gesture of deference. "Mrs. McGregor," he said, his voice heavy with apology. "It seems we misjudged the situation, and you." "People see what they're afraid of, Sheriff," Rebecca replied, her eyes on the horses in her corral. "Well, I don't think they'll be afraid of you anymore," Brody said, glancing back at the men who were now watching her with a mixture of awe and shame. "I think they'll be afraid for you if you ever decide to leave. Redemption Creek owes you an apology and a debt." He turned and followed his men back towards the town, leaving Rebecca alone once more. But this time the solitude was different. It was not the isolation of an outcast, but the quiet peace of a woman secure in her own place. The silence that returned was not empty. It was filled with the soft sounds of the gifted horses munching on the grass in her corral. Rebecca McGregor's life was forever changed. She was no longer just the widow on the edge of the world. She became a local legend, the woman of Cottonwood Creek. She was a bridge, a quiet testament to the idea that the line between friend and foe was not drawn on a map or by the color of one's skin, but by the content of one's actions. She never saw Black Eagle or his sons again, but their lives and hers were now interwoven into the fabric of the land itself. She had faced down fear, greed, and misunderstanding, and had done so not with a rifle, but with a simple, unwavering act of humanity, a lesson the wild, beautiful, and unforgiving Dakota territory was slowly, painfully learning to understand. In the end, the story of Rebecca McGregor isn't about a battle that was fought, but about one that was averted. It's a powerful reminder that in the vast, often brutal landscape of the American West, the greatest acts of courage weren't always loud, violent gunfights. Sometimes courage was a quiet, stubborn refusal to hate. It was the choice to see a child, not an enemy, and to extend a hand when every instinct screamed to raise a fist. Rebecca's story shows us that a single act of compassion can be more powerful than a militia, and that the deepest bonds are not forged in blood and conflict, but in the shared, simple moments of human decency. The history of the West is filled with forgotten stories like this one, tales of ordinary people who made extraordinary choices. If this story of courage and understanding moved you, please help us share it by hitting the like button. And if you believe these hidden histories deserve to be told, be sure to subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell. Share this video with someone who appreciates stories that reveal the true, complex heart of the past. Thank you for watching and for helping us keep these incredible stories alive.